for staying with us on The Real Story. A lot happened in Tuesday's midterm election nationally and here in Connecticut. Historically, the party in power loses seats in Congress, and while some of those results are still up in the air, it is clear that the predicted red wave didn't show itself as predicted. Here in Connecticut, voters stayed blue across Connecticut's constitutional offices. The governor's seat and Connecticut's House and Senate remain in Democratic control. So what does that say about Connecticut's GOP, the candidates running, and voters? We want to break down some of those results with Quinnipiac University's Senior Associate Dean of Arts and Sciences, Professor Wes Renfro. Thanks for being here, Wes, over Zoom.
Thanks.
Now, Wes, I know you were here on election night with us, provided some great analysis, so it's fun to kind of go back over this with you, the results that we're seeing. I want to start with the 5th Congressional District because this was just cleared up last Thursday and Wednesday, right? The Associated Press on Wednesday calling the race for Jahana Hayes, Secretary of the State's office, also saying after that she won as well. But a tight race. I mean, a little more than 1,800 vote difference between her and George Logan. Your thoughts when you saw those results? Was that surprising to you how close it was?
You know, this is a district that, for demographic reasons, is closer than some of the other districts in the state. And, you know, Democrats do have a little bit of an advantage in terms of registrations, but it's pretty tight. In a year in which we have a Democratic-leaning environment, this is a pretty safe seat for Democrats. But I think a lot of folks thought that the Republicans would have a really good showing in the election. That red wave, as you noted, didn't materialize. It was close, but I think most people expected it to tilt her direction. And without that red wave, she won.
And the 5th Congressional District has such an interesting makeup because it really has areas that are solid red and then areas that are generally, as we talked about, blue. And I know I was talking to someone who was saying that during her last election, it was certain cities like New Britain and Waterbury that had to show up in big droves for her to continue to secure that. And it does look like this time around that happened.
Yeah, you know, the district is interesting in a couple ways. It has, you know, cities, it has suburban areas, it has a lot of rural voters. It tends to be whiter mathematically than the rest of the state, with proportionally fewer African Americans, and that ties very strongly with partisanship. It's also the case that the larger left-leaning blue cities are not that big. Waterbury is the biggest, and the district actually doesn't represent the entirety of the city. And while Waterbury, I think, is the 5th largest city in the state, it's not the size of a place like Bridgeport or Hartford or New Haven. And so without that large, truly large blue anchor city, you know, the rural votes, and there's a lot of them, make it a more competitive district.
Professor Renfro, you know, 1,800 difference of a vote, as we were just discussing, did not trigger a recount. It would have to be 1,250 votes less, but that's still a small margin. Are you surprised that George Logan didn't challenge that? I mean, he conceded Thursday morning, and it doesn't look like there's going to be a lawsuit or any challenge that we know of as of right now.
So there's a couple things. Connecticut has a very clear automatic system for recounts. If a candidate, the winning candidate, or excuse me, the winner is less than half a percentage point, then there's an automatic recount, and there's some provisions also about the absolute number of votes. So it's pretty clear that there wouldn't be a recount. Now, that's not mutually exclusive with lawsuits that we see about contested ballots and should ballots count, should they be thrown out, are they legitimate? And we do see a lot of that in contested races. I would actually say that this is very much a credit to Connecticut's electoral system. There was one set of delayed results, and those actually helped push Jahana Hayes across the finish line. But it was a election with a lot of integrity, and frankly, I don't think there's much room for litigation. And so, if there were litigation, I think it would be frivolous and quickly dismissed. And George Logan did not choose to go down that path. Yeah,
you're talking about the town of Salisbury that had the issues that you were just referring to. Okay, so Connecticut's 4 other congressional seats all went blue again. We have the incumbents back in their seats. But we have this dynamic where we don't know the balance of power in Washington yet. Again, we're taping this on Thursday, so things could change by Sunday morning when this does air in full transparency. But, you know, I was thinking about it, and Representative Rosa DeLauro has this powerful position as co-chair of the Appropriations Committee. If the House does flip to Republican control, what happens with that position?
It's the same thing will happen to any Democratic member of the House who is in a leadership position on a committee. They will lose their positions. This is one of the real perks that comes with being in the majority. The people who occupy those roles are able to get things done or stall them and sometimes bring resources home to their districts and their state, but she will not be in that position.
All right, let's also talk about the race for governor, because that was another interesting one. Governor Ned Lamont had a substantial lead this time over Bob Stefanowski, and that was different from their race in 2018 when there was just 44,000 vote difference. I mean, that's with over 1 million votes cast, 44,000 votes originally is close. This time around, not so much. What was your take? What was different this time around?
You know, I think this was a very predictable race. Ned Lamont has been the most popular Democratic governor in the country for quite a long time. He has enjoyed quite high favorability ratings. I think there's a number of reasons for this. Connecticut's COVID response, I think, was very reasonable and appealed to many people in a state that goes by the land of steady habits. Our economy has done comparatively well. There have been some influxes from people out of state. The state has returned surpluses, and some of those monies have been spent in, frankly, thoughtful ways that helped the state's long-term fiscal position. There haven't really been personal controversies associated with the governor. And so he was in a really strong position as an incumbent. And the polling, and there was some pretty good high-quality polling all along, had him coming in at, 12, 13, 14 points ahead of Bob Stefanowski, and that's exactly what happened.
I'm curious for your take on this, because we're hearing all the polling before for the governor's race, for the U.S. Senate race, where him and Senator Blumenthal had these double-digit leads over their challengers. But there's a lot of skepticism with polls right now, because we think of in 2016 with the presidential election showed Hillary Clinton winning, and then boom, President Trump, won that, and it cast a lot of doubt over some of these polls. I know I talked to someone else, another political science professor, during the campaigns, who had said, well, yes, but if you look at all these different polls are showing the same thing, then you can probably confer that that's probably where people do stand. But what's your opinion on how should people look at polls out there?
Yeah, so polls in general are quite good. And it's sort of like when you look at the weather forecast and 6 of the 7 days match up with the weather forecast basically spot on. But on the 7th day, you want to have a day at the beach and there's a 20% chance of rain and it rains. That's sort of the one that folks tend to remember.
That's a big one.
There are some races in which polling is off. And frankly, that I think reflects the unsettled state of American politics. It's hard to poll people when it's not quite clear in their own minds who will they vote for, or if they're not willing to speak to pollsters, or if they change their mind at the last minute and show up when they previously hadn't planned to. Presidential elections are actually a little bit tricky because we poll people in 50 states plus the District of Columbia, but then we also have to contend with some of the oddness of the Electoral College, so that adds a layer of complication on. In general, polls are pretty good. They are, however, probabilistic, and I think the things that folks generally forget is that there's a margin of error. A margin of error on a good poll is going to be 3-4 percentage points in either direction. And for so many races in a country that is deeply and in many places evenly divided means that lots of, polls have outcomes that are within the normal range of probabilities. And, from a mathematical statistic perspective, when the poll gets, real close within the stated margins of error, the poll is accurate. But that's not the way that folks tend to interpret them. And so I think we sometimes need to remember that polls are not Nostradamus, and that they explicitly say there's some variability.
Yeah, that's a fair analysis with that right now. Okay, we have 2 minutes left here. I want to touch on our early voting amendment that Connecticut, pretty overwhelmingly passed. What happens next? Does that mean the next election we're going to have early voting? Obviously, it's going to take some time to get this up and running. What's the process?
Yeah, so the General Assembly has to take this up, and they will develop some of the rules, and they might delegate some of those to other state bodies. I would expect certainly that by 2024, in the next presidential election, if not sooner, that folks will have early voting in some form or the other. I
was listening to the Secretary of the State-elect, Stephanie Thomas, who is going to be rolling this out, rolling early voting out, and she was saying that it looks like we would maybe do something like 5 days before Election Day. You would be be able to vote. Do you think when you're looking at that compared to other states, that might be a good model? Again, nothing set in stone, but that's what she was saying they were looking at.
Yeah, there's actually kind of a range. Some states go longer than 5. 5 feels sort of intuitively like a reasonable time frame. I do think that the danger of going too far is that you might cast a vote and then late breaking news might sway you to change your mind, but you don't have a mechanism to alter your vote. Yeah,
that makes sense. And when you're saying too long, I mean, aren't there states that have it like a month before, if I'm recalling?
Yeah. There are some states that are pretty generous, and I believe some do go up to about 30 days.
Interesting. All right, Professor Wes Renfro with Quinnipiac University, thank you so much for coming on and giving us analysis once again. Always good to hear from you.
Thank you.
All right, and that does it for us on The Real Story. If you want to watch these segments again, you can head to fox61.com or download the Fox 61 News app. And please watch The Real Story every Sunday at 10 a.m. right here on Fox 61. You can also catch our segments streaming on Fox 61 Plus. Have a great morning.